September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany unleashed Blitzkrieg, invading Poland with heavily mechanized weaponry and beginning the Lightning War campaign that would see Hitler conquer most of Europe in only a few years. The invasion of Poland, of course, is the point traditionally used to mark the start of the Second World War. On September 3rd, 1939, both Britain and France declared war on Germany for their move into Poland. Yet, Poland was the last in a string of conquests that Hitler had been making in Europe in the name of righting the wrongs done to the German nation in the aftermath of the First World War. Before this, Hitler had bulldozed through Europe, annexing Austria and demanding that he be allowed to take over Czechoslovakia as well. Desperate for peace, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain followed a policy of appeasement, signing the Munich Agreement with Hitler, declaring, "Peace in our times." Even after the war was declared by Britain and France, Hitler was given free rein in Poland for months in a period that became known as the Phony War, where the British did not take any military action. Meanwhile, Stalin's USSR invaded the eastern part of Poland and did not engage with the Germans in accordance with the 1938 Nazi-Soviet pact that had been signed between the two.
Hitler was once again on the offensive in 1940. After conquering Poland in a month, he went on to roll over Denmark, Norway, Belgium and the Netherlands within a couple of months. In May, he entered France, defeating their army and establishing Nazi dominance. With France fallen, Britain remained the last line of defense for Europe. Realizing the key position of the island nation, Germany decided to wage blitzkrieg against the British, bombarding London. With the fall of France, Mussolini had spread the war to Africa, finally trying to put Italy on the imperial map. He overran a number of British colonies in Africa, including Egypt and Somaliland, giving the British a two-front battle. Isolated and abandoned by allies like the United States, Neville Chamberlain resigned from his post as Prime Minister to make way for Winston Churchill. Deeply opposed to the appeasement policies of Chamberlain, Churchill's grit and stubbornness would prove to be detrimental in the times to come.
He will be reasonable.
When will the lesson be learned? When will the lesson be learned? How many more dictators must be wooed, appeased, good God, given him mixed privileges, before we learn? You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth!
All the lights would go out. We weren't even allowed to light cigarettes because everyone thought that German pilots could see the light from it and drop bombs on London. Then Prime Minister Churchill set up underground bomb shelters. When an attack was about to happen, there would be a siren and we would all file to our respective stations and hide out the entire night. If it hadn't been for him, we would all have died.
In June 1941, fearing that Stalin was building up his military strength and would soon turn on him, Hitler launched the largest military attack in history, sending 3 million men and thousands of airplanes and tanks into Soviet territory in what is known as Operation Barbarossa. Initially, the Germans made great progress against Russia, unleashing their might and reaching the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. With no hope in sight, it would eventually be the Russian weather that would come to the rescue of Stalin, catching the Germans off guard and turning the tide of the war. The Germans would renew their offensive again in the coming spring. Attacking Stalingrad with the two opposing armies had a standoff lasting months, which ended in German surrender. Handed one of the worst defeats of the war by Russia, and already being pushed back by Churchill on the other end, Hitler found himself between a rock and a hard place. And with the USSR going on the offensive after their victory at Stalingrad, it seemed that the war in Europe was about to be over for Germany. Meanwhile, the war in Asia and the Pacific was going in a similar direction, with the Axis powers initially wreaking havoc and the Allies taking time to respond in turn. The war in the East first gained speed as the Japanese went on the offensive to try and capture unattended European colonies in the Far East. What they were not expecting was for the still teetering on isolationism United States to block their attempts and cut off crucial supply lines. Faced with either calling it quits on their conquests or taking on the US, the Japanese decided to wage war, in a move that would ultimately cost the Axis powers dearly. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese chose to inflict a surprise attack on the United States, bombing Pearl Harbor and killing nearly 3,500 people, while sinking part of the United States fleet. Japan then continued on with their plan of expansion, capturing most of Southeast Asia. While the Japanese did gain some serious short-term traction in the wake of Pearl Harbor, the event also drew the United States into the war. With Germany also declaring war on America, the US was now determined to take this all the way to the end. On June 6, 1944, the D-Day operation was launched, in which joint American, British, French soldiers liberated Nazi-occupied France. At the same time, the Soviets took to the offensive, moving into Germany, where Hitler was now effectively trapped in Berlin. With the Americans helping to liberate the areas annexed by Germany, the war in Europe seemed over. However, despite overwhelming odds, Germany held out for almost a year. But when the Soviets were in fact at the gates of Berlin, Hitler realized time was up. On April 30th, 1945, he committed suicide. Within a week of his death, on May 7th, 1945, German military leaders surrendered. As the dust settled from the fall of Berlin, the Allies began to realize the extent of evil that had been at the center of Nazi ideology, and the crimes against humanity that Hitler and his circle of evil had committed. One of the major discoveries were mass graves and concentration camps, with thousands of Jewish prisoners. The world was just discovering the atrocities of the Holocaust.
I grew up in an educated cultural family in Bratislava, then the capital of Czechoslovakia. I studied in a German grammar school until I was excluded because of my Jewish background. Then when Sudetenland had been annexed by Germany and Czechoslovakia was divided, life for the Jews became miserable. We weren't allowed to sit, in the public transport, and we were the last ones to be served in shops. My family was forced out of our apartment and given a tiny flat in the outskirts of the town. The Germans invaded Hungary in 1944, and the situation changed remarkably. One evening at 5 a.m., the police came to round everybody up, and I was taken along with them to Auschwitz. I spent about 6 weeks there on starvation rations. I was crammed into inhumane conditions with thousands of other people. And in the dying stages of the war, the Germans evacuated the camp. And I and the other women were taken on forced march towards Bergen-Belsen. Anyone lagging behind was shot.
With Hitler dead and Germany at their mercy, the Allied leaders were already meeting to decide how the post-war world would be shaped. The only remaining part was how the still belligerent Japan was to be dealt with. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing some 80,000 people. 3 days later, another atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 14th, the Japanese emperor gave the order to lay down arms. 2 weeks later, Japanese leaders signed the terms of surrender. The war was officially over, and the world was about to enter a new era. An era that would be divided by ideology, and two nuclear-armed superpowers facing off.